Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. I'm in Toronto, and this time we're not going to go very far, out to Waterloo, Ontario, which is a short drive from here. And we're going to meet an old friend, Tim Donais. Timothy Donais is a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University. That's Wilfrid, right?
Correct.
You had to correct me once. I
Two
wrote
eyes.
there, and you said I had with an E. Okay, Tim used to be, many years ago, on the editorial board of Peace magazine. So he would come to my dining table and read manuscripts once a month or once every 2 weeks. But that's a long time ago. And in the meantime, he's on to grander things. He is the director of a program at Wilfrid Laurier. He just gave me the proper title. It's something about global studies. Tell me again all these projects and programs that you administer. He's a head of it, but so I'm going to step down.
I'm co-director of the joint PhD program in global governance, which is joint between Laurier and the University of Waterloo, and I'm the director of Laurier's master's degree in international public policy.
Mm-hmm. How many students do you have?
The PhD program admits about a dozen students a year, and in the MIP program, the master's program, we have anywhere between 20 and 25 in any given year.
Well, I recommend that. If you guys are thinking of taking a program, a PhD someplace in good, how to be a good world citizen, Tim's the man to go to. So there you go.
And the Balsillie School is a beautiful. Once we get back into the building, the Balsillie School is a beautiful place to do research and deep thought.
I've never been in it, but okay. All right. So what I would want to do is just plain get caught up with you, because I haven't been really in touch with you in several years. I mean, I know you're there, but that's it. And I want to find out what your research has been about lately. You've always been in peacekeeping or things related to that, but let's start off with, I think maybe we can work backward. Sure. Let's talk about the most recent projects you've been doing in Africa.
Sure.
All right. What are you up to?
So yeah, as you know, Meta, I've been involved really since the early 1990s in larger questions of peacekeeping and peace building. The most recent project is really an offshoot of that. It's looking specifically at peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping operations, but even more specifically than that, it's looking at the growing importance of protection of civilian mandates in UN peacekeeping operations. And these have become both prominent and somewhat controversial in the UN's big four peacekeeping missions in Africa. So Mali, the Central African Republic, South Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. In all of these cases, the protection of civilians mandates or POC mandates have become the most prominent element of the UN operation, and the missions have really struggled. I mean, in a lot of cases, they've managed to protect vulnerable people in threatening circumstances, but the gap between the capacities of UN missions to actually protect and the extent of the vulnerability remains enormous. So the project is really looking at the range of strategies missions use to protect civilians, and looking forward how the UN might think about new different strategies in the context of very constrained resources in which they can actually offer the most protection with not an increased amount of resources, because peacekeeping, as you probably know, is not growing in terms of the resources that the United Nations is actually devoting to it. So the challenge is how to actually protect the most civilians without actually having increased resources to do so, because the needs in places like DRC or South Sudan are really in some ways unlimited, given the instability of these conflicts and the lack of a viable peace process.
They're not even negotiating. There's no, it's just a plain out and out war. And there's nobody trying to bring the combatants into any kind of ceasefire or agreement.
Well, it depends where you're talking about. I mean, South Sudan is the one case I've been focusing on recently, and of course, we've like many researchers, I've been unable to do field work over the past year and a half because of the pandemic, but had managed to do some field work in South Sudan prior to everything shutting down last March. I mean, in South Sudan, there is a peace agreement in place. It's been brokered not by the UN, which is typical, but actually by IGAD, which is a regional security organization, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. But it's a very fragile peace agreement. It's what we would call an elite compact, which is basically trying to get the two leading figures in the government and the opposition to work together. And they don't like each other. They would just as soon kill each other as co-govern. And it has been a real struggle to get the peace process off the ground. And in the meantime, we've seen a lot of a resurgence of local level violence. And the mission has been really struggling to try to figure out how to actually offer the most protection in these kind of circumstances. So that's a really difficult environment in which to think about protection of civilians, because there's no end game in a sense. Everybody's hopeful that the peace agreement will hold, but nobody is particularly optimistic.
By the way, you mentioned the COVID thing is a handicap. How are they? We don't hear much about how much COVID has impacted those countries or any place in Africa.
It's really difficult to get a sense of COVID in some of these countries, just because of the lack of information and the lack of testing. I mean, certainly early on in the pandemic, one of the paradoxes was how Africa seemed by and large to be bypassed by the pandemic. There was lots of speculation that it was because various factors like the relative youth of African populations, or the fact that they've had to deal with a lot of other endemic diseases over the years. So Africans might have had more resistance to COVID. More recently, though, we've seen, I think, some concerning developments that the cases of COVID in certain African countries, for sure, have been on the rise. I mean, South Africa had a serious problem with COVID over the past year, and it certainly has affected the way in which peacekeeping missions have operated, in part because I think for a lot of Africans, COVID is perceived as a Western, at least at the beginning, as a Western problem and a Western disease. So there was, I think, a lot of suspicion of outsiders as being responsible for bringing it in. So for the UN, I think they had to be extremely careful in terms of how they related to local communities and trying not to betray the trust, which is difficult because a lot of protection strategies actually rely increasingly on very close community engagement. So having to move to kind of remote engagement and back into the armored personnel carriers as a dividing line between peacekeepers and local communities, I think, has really complicated the work of the UN. At least on that front, anyway.
There have been cases in which peacekeepers brought in diseases. I think, was it Haiti where they brought in?
That's the most famous, infamous case. Yeah, it was cholera.
Cholera, yeah.
In the aftermath of the earthquake in 2010, the UN inadvertently introduced cholera, a very serious strain of cholera, into Haiti, and just compounded the misery. And I don't think the UN ever recovered in Haiti as a result of that. So yeah, I mean, and it's a good example to raise, because it's a reminder that the UN is actually very sensitive to that kind of an issue now as a result of the Haiti experience.
Okay, so you were, or somebody goes in with a gang of peacekeepers. How many would there be, and what kinds of strategies would you use to try to protect the civilians?
Well, just to go back to the South Sudan case again, I mean, this is in some ways it's a unique case because the mission was on the ground when, as South Sudan declared independence in 2011, the country descended into civil war at the end of 2013, and what happened was that you had tens of thousands of civilians who actually fled to UN bases seeking protection amidst the violence. And I guess recalling what happened in places like Srebrenica in the mid-1990s, the UN took the decision at that point to actually let them in to the bases. So these created a whole series of what became known as protection of civilian sites, which were essentially co-located with UN bases. And these sites have persisted since 2013. I visited a couple of them. I was in Bentiu in the summer of 2019, where there's still about 120,000 displaced persons living and under the protection of UNMISS, which is the UN mission there. There was a site in Juba, the capital, which held about 30,000. These sites are now slowly being transitioned to the control of the government of South Sudan, which is not uncontroversial. But for the past 8 years in South Sudan, the primary mechanism through which the UN has protected civilians has been through these so-called POC sites. So you had about, at their height, about 250,000 vulnerable civilians within these sites, which is a bit of a paradox because through this time, by some measures, the majority of UN resources were devoted to the protection of these civilians in these sites. And the UN had, as a result of that, very little capacity to protect any of the millions of vulnerable civilians who were living outside of those sites. So you had literally 4 million internally displaced persons. Latest statistics suggest that almost 7 million South Sudanese are highly food insecure and in need of humanitarian assistance. So the needs are enormous, but the UN was able to argue that we are protecting civilians. We're saving literally hundreds of thousands of lives on a daily basis through these POC sites, but it's a very small proportion of the civilians that are in need of protection.
Well, this certainly doesn't sound like a new thing, because I remember something like that happened in East Timor, didn't it? The UN had a base or something, and people would come there to be protected. I don't. It must not have been more than a few thousand possible there. And I remember when the biggest part of the war in Syria was going on. There was I think Mary Calidor and I had a conversation about it, in which she thought that's what should be done there, is set up sites inside Syria.
Protected areas.
Yeah.
I mean, this of course goes back to the Bosnian War as well, where the UN disastrously set up safe areas, so-called safe areas, including Srebrenica, which we know how that story ended up, unfortunately.
Because you couldn't defend it. But anyway, so was that ever seriously considered, by the way, in Syria? I don't know why it was ruled out. I remember somebody else said, no, that's not practical. Do you remember hearing any serious discussion of that as a possibility for Syria?
No, I mean, I don't think it was ever a serious possibility, just because of the divisions within the Security Council around Syria. They couldn't agree on anything, essentially, in terms of how to respond. So I suspect there were some preliminary discussions around the possibility of that. Some trial balloons floated, but they were never really able to get consensus. And still to this day, I mean, there's very little consensus on how the UN or the Security Council or the broader international community should approach Syria. So,
well, I could see
we've seen the consequences.
I could see, as far as you're already saying, that there's a disadvantage if you can't protect the masses of people outside. Are there people in the protected areas who can't come from both sides? In other words, do they bring their fight into the protected area and just do it more quietly, or does that really stop them when they come in?
No, I mean, in the South Sudan case, there has been. I mean, the POC sites are multi-ethnic. In some of them, they're sort of distinct areas of the camp where different communities, sometimes members of the same ethnicity, some of whom support the government side, some of whom support the opposition side. So certainly these sites are susceptible to the same internal politics that exist outside the sites. And there has been violence. The perimeters of these sites are notoriously porous, so weapons come in and out, people come in and out, and it's been challenging in terms of actually being able to provide protection even within these contained spaces. And of course, South Sudan is really a unique example. If you look at the DRC or if you look at the Central African Republic, these are missions which are in fact smaller now than the South Sudan mission, with protection mandates spanning the entire country, right? Where you have 14, 15,000 peacekeepers who are expected to provide protection across these vast expanses of inhospitable terrain where you can't move around except by helicopter in the rainy season. And it's POC has been described in a book 15 years ago as the impossible mandate, and I think it's still very, very true to this day, where it's an enormous challenge in terms of trying to understand where the protection threats are, what the best responses are, how to generate the intelligence to know what's about to happen in a particular area and get resources there in terms of being able to head off or preclude atrocities against civilians, the civilian capacity to engage with communities and negotiate with armed actors. I mean, the UN, for all of its resources, the UNMISS mission is $1 billion mission, is extremely thin on the ground when you get right down to it. I was in southern South Sudan a couple of years ago in a place called Yambio, and the UN police contingent in Yambio, which is responsible for an area, at one point I figured out it's about the size of the state of Indiana, and they had 13 UN police officers responsible for this whole vast area. So in many cases,
what would you do if you were one of those 13? What did they do, and what should they be doing instead?
Well, that's the $1 million question. I mean, they would. There's a couple of different models, competing models that get thrown around in terms of how to go about fulfilling a protection of civilian mandates. There's been a lot of discussion about the difference between a protection through projection model, which is a somewhat more force-centric. It's akin to kind of imagining a UN SWAT team where you get word that an atrocity is about to happen over the next hilltop. You throw a bunch of peacekeepers, armed peacekeepers in a helicopter. You fly them into the affected community, you try to sort things out, and then you fly off to the next crisis zone, right? I mean, in some ways, that's this idea of projection, where you try to understand what's going on and have a very mobile, nimble kind of reaction force that can respond to these things. The other model is protection through presence, and this is back to the question of the 13 UN police officers. I mean, this is the model that they try to deploy as much as possible, given obviously the limited resources, is trying to be out there in the communities, developing contacts, facilitating the development of community alert networks, for example, that can actually call into the mission field office and say, look, we have a problem here. Can someone come out and try to help us head off violence? So it's really very much around being present, being a deterrent, but also being a facilitator, right? Trying to work with the different groups in ways that can actually prevent violence in the first place, rather than having to respond to it once it erupts.
Once you get the phone call, come quickly. There's a fight brewing. and you go there. Now you see, what do you see? Some gangs marching up the street ready to attack somebody, or what? And what would you do? Do you say, come and let's have a little conference, sit down under the tree and let's talk? Or do you try, what would you do? You're going to try to mediate a conflict, or you're going to pull your guns and say, don't you take one more step forward or I'll shoot? I mean, someplace in between that, I imagine.
Well, it's all of the above, I think, and this is one of the difficulties of protecting civilians, is that you have this whole range of potential responses, right? And what the response looks like very much actually depends on who's in charge of the military contingent that's responding. Right? The UN is still, when it comes to its uniformed element, is still very decentralized. So the whoever the force commander is going to be the one to take those decisions around how to respond. So if it's the Mongolians, who have an incredible reputation in South Sudan as being brave and fearless and courageous,
Really?
They're more than willing to open fire if the circumstances demand. They're more than willing to take casualties if needed. In other cases, there are troop contributing countries who would, under no circumstances, open fire against a rebel group that's attacking a community. I mean, and we have lots of examples of protection failures where the UN has actually failed to intervene, even when they were there and had the capacity and the mandate to do so. So it depends who the offending forces are. In a lot of cases, this is the case in both DRC and South Sudan, those committing the atrocities are actually government forces, which is a real problem for the UN, because the UN depends on the consent of the government to be operating in the country in the first place. So if you start going head to head against the security forces of the government, you have a very serious political problem on your hands very quickly.
The needing to be invited in by the government. I mean, there is this other, Chapter 7 or something like that, when there's an extreme case where the UN can go in and
peacekeeping has always operated sort of in this awkward territory between Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. I mean, Chapter 6 is sort of permissive. It's the kind of Cyprus-style peace operation where soldiers, peacekeepers, are lightly armed, don't use force. Only use force in self-defense, and a Chapter 7, which is more robust, with the potential of being able to enforce and impose solutions against the will of the conflict parties. I mean, the way the POC mandates have evolved, I mean, the Security Council resolutions have been very clear over the last decade or so. I mean, almost all of them mandate peacekeepers to use, and the phrase is, all necessary means, up to and including deadly force, in defending threatened civilian populations. And it doesn't differentiate between whether the threatening forces are rebels or governments. But on the ground, when you're interpreting these mandates, mission leaders, obviously, these distinctions matter, because they're the ones who actually have to sit down with government officials on a day-to-day basis and try to advance the peace process. So, there's this sort of awkward line between the respect for traditional peacekeeping principles, right, which are non-use of force unless in self-defense or defense of the mandate, impartiality, consent of the parties, and these more robust POC mandates, which sit very awkwardly with some of those traditional peacekeeping principles.
Well, is there still the sense that even when you've been authorized to use whatever force you want or need, is there still a sense that the president could say, you can pack up and go now just leave, and that you would have to do it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean,
So,
the mission could be declared persona non, as if you will, non grata by the government, and then it would be in a very awkward position, and it would be untenable for a mission to stay on the ground without the explicit authorization of the government to be
okay,
there.
when I take the Korean War, let's just maybe try to help me get my own muddled thinking straightened out here, because I thought Chapter 7 really said that the UN could enforce some sort of decision on a state against whether it liked it or not.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that would mean they could go in even if the government said go away. Mm-hmm. Right? Now, wasn't the Korean War the outgrowth of that kind of situation?
Yeah, I think it probably was. I think the situation with current Chapter 7 mandates is different, and I think it's important to make a distinction. And the United Nations, and peacekeeping specifically, is very careful to keep a very clear red line between robust peacekeeping on the one hand, which remains loosely within those traditional peacekeeping principles, including consent of the conflict parties, especially the government, and peace enforcement, right? Mm-hmm. And peace enforcement is missions which are mandated to actually go in and impose a peace against the will of the conflict parties, including the governments. Right? I mean, the UN has always been loath to become engaged, become involved in peace enforcement operations, and I think given the current geopolitical climate, I think there's very little appetite on the part of the members of the Security Council to consider peace enforcement. So I think even if there's a fine line between robust peacekeeping on the one side and peace enforcement on the other side, the UN has always been very careful to stay on the left side of that, the less coercive side of that.
How many cases has it crossed that line? Has anybody kept track of?
Certainly none in the 2000s. I wouldn't say. I mean, we can go back to Somalia in the early 1990s, where effectively there was no government to ask consent to or from, and consent was deemed to be assumed on the basis of the collapse of the government. I mean, we can go back to the Congo in the 1960s, which is sort of the first and in some ways a cautionary tale of the risks and the dangers of peace enforcement. Since about the Brahimi report, which came out in the year 2000, I think there's been a recognition that the UN and the institution of peacekeeping is simply not equipped to do the kind of enforcement operations that NATO can do, for example, and did do in places like.
Wouldn't we want that to happen when we, Project Save the World has this platform for survival, and one of the planks has to do with sustainable common security, and which really comes down to the proposal for the UN to have a peacekeeping. What do we call it? I don't know.
A standing UN army.
Yeah, but they want to call it something milder because it would include social workers and mediators and all civilians and people like that. But people, a unit that would be under direct control of the UN, not you don't have to go and get countries to contribute forces. It would be ready to go at the drop of a hat. And would be adequate to go into 3 or 4 hot spots in the world simultaneously if necessary. The idea being, and I think it's a big hope, would be if people could see that there would be a unit of that kind, such a strong one that they could count on it for protection, that they wouldn't need to have standing armies, national armies, or at least they could have very, very modest units. So that kind of solution has always appealed to me because even though it would mean an increase in military forces under the UN control, it would mean that overall in the world there'd be much smaller military. But that would presume, I guess, that it would also have the authority to do what you call peace enforcement, right? Where does that idea stand? I think it's probably gone absolutely nowhere in the last few years, but we can't help dreaming.
No, of course, and we should. I mean, I remember being on a call with you a number of years ago with Peter Langille, who has long been talking about and advocating this idea of a UN standby force. I think the problem in this current geopolitical environment is that we're a lot further away from that vision, perhaps, than we've ever been. Right? I mean, the tensions within the Security Council between the United States and China and Russia are as profound as they have been for decades. Certainly the Chinese and the Americans are very defensive about questions of sovereignty and continued adherence to these principles of non-intervention. They want to control what the UN does, how the UN does, and where it does it. So I don't know of any serious conversation at the UN level, at the level of important member states, in terms of advancing this idea of a UN standby force. In fact, in terms of peacekeeping, we're actually going in the opposite direction. Right? The Americans have been pushing strongly since when Donald Trump was president to reduce peacekeeping budgets, to putting downward pressure on some of these missions. I mean, the mission in the DRC, which has been on the ground since 1999 in various guises, is being reduced in terms of the human resources, in terms of the money, in terms of things like helicopters. Which is there's no connection to the situation on the ground, because you would imagine that the Security Council would say we'll only begin to draw back or draw down missions when the situation allows it. But the discussion around budgets has no relationship to the situation on the ground. So the situation could be getting worse, and yet the missions are being scaled back. Largely because of domestic politics, and largely because of some of these other larger considerations. So, I mean, the UN has a larger budgetary crisis in general, to the extent that there was concerns about keeping the lights on and the elevators working at UN headquarters in New York, but that escalates as well in terms of the peacekeeping budget, right? Troop contributors, in a lot of cases, haven't been reimbursed for their contributions. So in that particular environment where there's the preoccupation seems to be with shrinking peacekeeping, the idea of actually expanding to something along the lines of what you were describing is a long way off, and will require a very different kind of conversation than the one that's going on now.
Yeah. You're not surprising me. I hadn't looked specifically, but I sure didn't get the impression that things were on the upward bound in the UN. That's just very, very disturbing. Okay, inside one of these protected areas, what is life like? Do you set up tents and people to live there? Are there borders? I mean, gates where somebody says, you can't come in if you have a gun, leave your gun outside. What's it like? Do they, describe one of these sites. Is it like these, we see refugee camp photos in Jordan and in Turkey and places.
Yeah.
Does this look like that, or what?
Never having been inside a refugee camp, but my guess is that it looks reasonably similar. I mean, I can describe the POC site in Bentiu, which is in northern South Sudan, because I spent several days there a couple of summers ago. I mean, it is a huge tent city, right? There's 120,000 people living there, all in tents. It's well established enough that there are schools, there are churches, there are community centers. It is self-governed. They have their own system of government within these sites, reasonably well managed. Life is not great by any means. I mean, the site is in an open field. When it rains, it turns into a huge mud bowl. But at the same time, because, I mean, I guess the difference between a refugee camp is that in these POC sites, it is actually the United Nations mission, which is providing both perimeter security and internal security, largely through UN police. So one of the dilemmas with these POC sites is that the UN has wanted to close them down for a number of years now, in part because the services that people can get by living within these sites, regardless of the level of security, is actually greater than what they would get if they were to return to their home community. So in some ways, the POC sites have become a magnet for South Sudanese, because it's relatively secure, because the services that the humanitarian community, which is also there in force, provides are concentrated in these sites in a way that they're not elsewhere in outside of the wire, if you will. So it's been a dilemma, right? And the government of South Sudan has also accused the UN of harboring extremists within these POC sites, and rebel groups using the POC sites as refuges where they can plan and stay safe from attacks from the government, right? Whether there's truth to that or not, they've really become a political football.
How do they screen them? If a person comes knocking and says, "I want in," do they do a little intake assessment and decide, do you have the right politics? Are you
right?
How many people have you killed already?
Yeah. Well, I think in the case, I think in some ways you just answered your own question, because it's impossible, of course, for the UN to know who's coming in and who's coming out. They certainly vet for weapons and try to make sure that the POC sites are as much as possible demilitarized, but they don't really know, right? Who living within the confines of the POC site is a vulnerable civilian in need of protection, who is a rebel fighter who's got the blood of dozens of innocents on his hands, who is there not because of insecurity, but because life is actually better in the POC sites. So I think the rule of thumb to date is that anybody who wants access to the POC sites, as long as they don't bring weapons inside, is welcome, right? Mm-hmm. We had, when Sudan went through its period of turmoil in 2020, with the change of government, a lot of South Sudanese who had been living in Sudan proper actually came back to South Sudan, which was considered to be more stable, and a lot of them ended up in the POC sites because this was seen as a more desirable place to live than elsewhere. So they have become somewhat of a magnet for populations, and it's a bit of a dilemma, because the long-term goal obviously is to get people back to their own home communities, to shut these places down, and to, in a sense, free up the UN to be able to deploy protection resources elsewhere, because for so many years they've really been tied down to these POC sites.
Yeah, are there technological solutions, or are there any inventions or that you can think of involving improved surveillance or better advanced warning systems, or things that might make it more easy to monitor a large area outside the protection zone. You mentioned improving methods of, that part of the goal is to how best to protect civilians.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What is being considered? Are there any innovations?
Yeah. Well, certainly, yeah. No, there's been quite a few innovations. Not all of them are technological. The MONUSCO mission in DRC has, in fact, been considered one of the leading innovators in the practice of protecting civilians over the past decade or so, because they've had to be inventive, they've had to be creative. So they innovated, for example, the use of things like community liaison assistants, right? These individuals who were essentially key interfaces between the mission, and particularly the military components of the mission, and local communities, where information communications could be relayed back and forth. They set up initially this network of community alert networks, where they provided cell phones to community leaders so they could be in touch around emerging protection threats. The technology question is interesting because, and I'm sure you've spoken in the past to Walter Dorn, who is one of the leading authorities on the use of technology, including things like drones in UN peacekeeping operations. I think there's a lot of potential there in terms of monitoring areas, in terms of things like remote patrolling of the perimeters of POC sites, for example, to look for people who are moving guns in and out. One of the obstacles to the greater use of technology on the part of peacekeeping missions, in addition to the budgetary questions that we've talked about earlier, these things are expensive, is government sensitivities. Right? In South Sudan, for example, I think UNMISS at one point proposed bringing in a series of drones to be able to help it do precisely that kind of monitoring work, and the government would not permit it, because they were worried that the UN was going to use these drones as a means of spying on it. So that's where you're back into the politics of peacekeeping missions in terms of the consent of the host government, and what it will allow and what it won't allow.
Yeah.
Because the government in this case is one of the parties to the conflict, it's very sensitive to questions of what the UN can and can't do within its territory.
If they weren't, if they didn't have some sort of guilt, I don't think they would be so sensitive.
Yes, but in terms of, beyond the technology piece, I mean, one of the things in the current project that I'm working on that I have been focusing on a fair bit is this tension between coercive and non-coercive protection strategies. Given the problems with the use of force in peacekeeping operations, which we've already discussed, I mean, I've increasingly been focusing on the use of the non-coercive kind of protection strategies, which the innovations there are all around really community engagement and network building, and working on local level peace building, essentially, right? Trying to build up community resilience, trying to increase the communication between the UN mission and local communities, that if communities can't prevent conflict from erupting and violence from erupting, at least they can be facilitated in terms of getting out of the way. So I think there's a lot more scope in the institution of peacekeeping to build on those sorts of strategies. Certainly in the South Sudan context, where a lot of the violence right now is not government forces against rebel forces, it's actually at the community level. It's conflict between farmers and herders, which has been longstanding in South Sudan. It's conflicts around cattle raiding, which are more economic and ethnic in nature. Clashes across ethnic lines within particular regions that actually may or may not have to do with national level politics. And I think in those kinds of circumstances, the UN actually has greater scope for its sort of dialogue and engagement function, the kind of good offices that the UN has long been known for in terms of trying to negotiate deals between farmers and herders, for example, so that the cattle don't trample farmers' crops as they go through in search of water, right? I mean, those are areas where I think there's a lot of potential to actually facilitate nonviolent solutions. And in South Sudan, there's actually been, the mission has had some success in trying to mediate those kind of conflicts. So in terms of the development of POC mandates and the evolution of protection of civilians, I see more scope for building up those kinds of initiatives and activities than necessarily going down the route of robust peacekeeping where you're actually taking out armed groups by force. There's the one experience of that in the Democratic Republic of Congo with the UN mission has been quite controversial, right? Where the Security Council mandated and created this so-called Force Intervention Brigade with a specific mandate to go after a specific rebel group, and a lot of there was a lot of concern that this all of a sudden made the United Nations an actual party to the conflict, because they were actually they were taking sides, right?
Yeah.
They were going after an enemy of the government, and as a consequence of that, were seen as on one side of the conflict rather than the other, which has historically been a very uncomfortable place for the UN to find itself.
That's a whole conversation, is how often the UN has wound up being a warfighting institution rather than a peacemaking outfit. That is something I'm curious about. But certainly one would hope that the kinds of interventions you're talking about, the preventing of conflict is getting worse, it would be the most desirable way of approaching.
And it's also where the UN's comparative advantage lays, frankly. I mean, this is what the UN was created to do, essentially. So.
Yeah, that's true. But is it really the best way, the best institution for handling such things? There is in the current issue of Peace Magazine a review about of a book, which I can't even think of the title right now, but it's a woman who is arguing that foreigners, which means peacekeepers, are not very well suited for this kind of thing. That a local chieftain, for example, is in a better position to do that kind of thing because they know the language, they know the culture, etc. And then when the UN goes in and tries to patch up local feuds, they don't necessarily do a very good job of it. I have another friend.
There's truth to that, I think, yes.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point. I have another friend, Ann Swidler, who's been working in Malawi with on development issues, but mostly AIDS prevention, HIV issues. And she has pretty much the same point of view, that foreign development groups go in and they're good at giving free lunches to people, but when they go home, there's no real lasting change in the community. And I didn't want to listen to her. I was she's my friend, but I didn't want to hear that. Right. And I think Walter Dorn wasn't looking for that kind of critique from that book either. And we had a conversation about that. I can see why. Well, what's your answer to that? You say there's some truth to it. Well, what?
Well, I mean, this goes back to some of my earlier research before the current project, which was around peace building. And as you may recall, I spent years grappling with this larger question of local ownership in peace building processes. And over the past decade, in fact, there has been in the peace and conflict studies literature, what has become known as the so-called local turn in peace building research, which is focusing increasingly on precisely that dilemma you just articulated, the idea that we focused for so long on the agency of outsiders to come in and quote unquote fix conflict affected societies. We have very little to show for it in places like Bosnia, and places like Haiti, and places like Afghanistan. So the failures of the so-called liberal peace-building model have led people to focus increasingly on the local agency for peace-building, the kind of local chieftain that you just talked about. So, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to that argument. It's interesting to note that the local turn literature hasn't gone as far as to say that outsiders should simply leave. Right? This will let the locals sort it out, get out of the way, and eventually a solution will come. I think in a case like South Sudan, for example, there's a couple of dilemmas I think that come to the fore when you think about those kinds of considerations. The opportunity, I guess, is really around the ways in which the United Nations and other international actors can not necessarily be the direct mediators or the ones trying to fix the problems, but actually facilitators. Right. So the South Sudan Council of Churches, for example, has been very active in trying to facilitate both national level and local level peace agreements in the context of South Sudan over the years. The UN has supported these efforts, right? Things such as simple as logistics, right, where they bring community leaders on either side of a conflict together via helicopter so that they can actually talk, right? So I think there's a lot of scope for that kind of supportive, facilitative peace-building approach, where outsiders are there to provide the material assistance and the presence in order to create enough confidence that these things can actually unfold. The dilemma, I think, the key dilemma with the idea of letting the locals sort out their own peace process also comes to the fore in a place like South Sudan, where you have this huge gap, as you do in a place like Haiti, between the elites and the vast majority of ordinary citizens. Right? You can make a case, I think, in the South Sudan case, that the peace agreement is really about trying to buy off political elites, a very small group of political elites whose interest in governing has less to do with the human development and human security of their own citizens and more to do with actually capturing as much of the wealth of South Sudan, and particularly its oil revenues, as they possibly can. So, I mean, Alex de Waal has made the argument that South Sudan came into existence as a kleptocracy, right? And the fact that there's no functioning governance institutions has much to do with the fact that in the pre-independence period, these political elites, the guys who used to run the Sudan People's Liberation Army, basically spent that period siphoning off as much of the country's oil wealth as they possibly could. And that continues, right? This is why people want power in South Sudan. It's why people want power in Haiti, is because being in power is the most viable path to wealth and security. So the dilemma for outside actors, I think, is that if you let the locals solve their own problems, you ignore these kind of power dynamics, and the grassroots is going to be shut out and ignored, and you're going to end up with these tyrannies of a very small predatory political elite, which doesn't lead to stability, doesn't lead to democracy, doesn't lead to the rule of law. I mean, Haiti, I think, is a very good example of what happens when you have a very small group of elite actors who are in power because of their interest in wealth and have very little interest in their own citizens. Right? We've seen the instability in Haiti over the past number of years.
Exactly.
So that's a real dilemma, I think, in terms of how you intervene in the power relations of countries like this, where you don't have stable institutions, you don't have anything resembling a social contract between rulers and ruled, where there is mutual respect, mutual obligations, and mutual responsibilities.
Damned if you do and damned if you don't.
In some ways.
Sounds like you're going to lose either way.
Which is why I think there's been a more general disillusionment with peace processes on the part of big donors and big countries, and a disillusionment which I think is only going to be accelerated.
Was there ever a good outcome from a situation like that? And if so, what works best?
Places like Somaliland managed to stabilize largely on the basis of traditional institutions and traditional networks of elders who got together and found a way to make the place work based on local legitimacy. I mean, East Timor, I suspect, after a few early stumbles with regard to the post-independence period, has emerged as a reasonably stable country. We used to talk about Rwanda as a success story of locally owned peace building. We don't so much anymore, given the increasingly authoritarian nature of that regime. But so Sierra Leone, Liberia have done reasonably well in the past decade or so. You can point to the importance of strong, enlightened leadership, right? Liberia, most people will point to the presidency of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in a crucial period of Liberia's peace-building process, and everybody is familiar with the role of Nelson Mandela in South Africa, right? Again, the importance of enlightened leadership, enlightened domestic leadership in these cases, and certainly that's the cases that are least successful are the cases where the leadership is actually been the opposite of enlightened. Right, and I think again,
I'm thinking of Myanmar right now.
Myanmar, I mean, you name it.
Right? Amazing flip flop there.
Yeah. And again, back to the South Sudan case. I mean, the people who are in power in South Sudan are right. I mean, they don't have the best interests of their countries. Of their countries at heart, right? And there's very little. It's difficult. You can't choose as the international community. It's very difficult to choose your partners. And if you have partners who are more interested in their own wealth and power than in peace, even in a general sense, it makes peacekeeping and peace building a very difficult proposition.
This has been extremely interesting. I'm really glad we finally got caught up. We aren't caught up. We only made a dent in it, but it's a good start anyway. And it's very encouraging to me to think that you're out there doing good deeds in the world, and as well.
Well, hopefully we'll be able to be back in the world again one day, since most of us have been stuck at home for the past 18 months or so.
Well, but you've been managing, I guess, Wilfrid Laurier and turning out dozens of more small Tim Donais to populate the world.
God help us, Meta.
Okay, thanks so much, Tim. It's been fun.
Thank you.
Take care.
Nice to see you.
Bye.
Yeah, all the best.